We're going to go through the.
This meeting is being recorded.
Very good. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all. Glad we're all able to get the band together and looking forward to more of these meetings coming up. I'm Adam Block, Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. This open meeting of the Needham Council of Economic Advisors, and in particular the district-focused subcommittee, is being conducted remotely consistent with current state regulations and is being recorded. Public access to this meeting does not ensure that there will be public participation unless required by law. This particular meeting will not have public comment. First, we'll confirm that all members of the CEA, and in particular this subcommittee, are present. When I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. For others, which I'll do momentarily, for others that are participating in the meeting, please do be aware that others may be able to see you and hear you. So anything you share or state will be a matter of public record. All supporting materials for this meeting, including the agenda, are available on the town's website at needham.gov, unless otherwise noted. The ground rules for this meeting are designed to allow for an accurate public record. I will introduce each of the speakers and committee members on our agenda, including staff, and then any motions will be voted on by roll call. At this point, I'm going to take a roll call attendance. I'm going to call it out as I see it on my screen. Bob Henschel.
Here.
Mike Wilcox.
Here.
Adam Eisner.
Here.
Matt Talkoff.
Here.
And our newest member, welcome to the CEA, Jeremy Halper.
Present.
Very good. And I also like to introduce Amy Helson, who is our fantastic manager of economic development.
And Rick just joined us again.
Yeah,
Rick,
I figured it out.
You can see yourself?
I can see everybody else.
And you can see yourself?
I hate flying blind.
I know. It's, I will say that this is, it's always a good thing, but vanity can sometimes be a curse. So Rick is present, and our economic development manager, Amy Helson.
Yep. And I also wanted to point out that Maureen Callahan from Representative Denise Garlick's office is here as an attendee as well.
Thank you for mentioning that, Maureen. We're happy to see you. If you hear anything or if you have any questions and would like to participate, please do let us know. We're always happy to have the support of Representative Garlick. So grateful that you're able to at least observe these proceedings. So our agenda this morning, which most of you should, or all of you should have, is going to focus predominantly on our subcommittee activity, which has been generally focused on two walking tours of Needham Center and the Chestnut Street district. The first thing I'd like to do is, can I please have a motion to accept our minutes from the September 1, 2021 meeting?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion from Rick, and we have a second from Matt Talkoff. Thank you very much. I will, any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the roll in the order which I see people on my screen. Please respond either yay or nay. And this is to approve the minutes. Bob Henschel.
Yay.
Mike Wilcox.
Yay.
Adam Meisner.
Yay.
Matt Talkoff.
Yay.
And Rick Putperish.
Yay.
Both. I also would like to note for the record that Dylan is with us as well. Dylan and Jeremy, since you were not part of the meetings before, we're not going to have you participate in this particular roll call, but we will obviously going forward. Can I actually have a motion to approve the minutes of the November 3 and January 5 meetings as well, please?
So moved.
We have a motion from Matt Telkoff, and do I have a second?
Second.
And a second from Bob Henschel. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the roll. Bob Henschel,
Aye. Yay, whatever, sorry.
Mike Wilcox,
Yay.
Adam Eisner,
Yay.
Matt Talkoff,
Yay.
Rick Puprush,
Yay.
and the chair is aye. The chair is also an aye for the motion to approve the September 21, 2021 minutes as well. So those minutes have been approved. Thank you very much. So now we'll take a couple of minutes to review, the goals of the Needham Center and the Lower Street business districts. Amy, I think you had included a material. I'm just pulling it up.
Yeah, the downtown study final report, the Needham Center
was-
Development Plan.
And can you confirm when this was conducted?
It was conducted back in 2009, and it was the impetus for the overlay districts that were then created in Needham Center to allow for mixed use development.
Okay, and to briefly review, the concept at that time was intended, I think, to the goals were effectively to redevelop the Chestnut Street strip in particular. This is what we're seeing here, and the center business district. And the proposal was to, which passed, was on Garden Street to go from 2.5 stories to 2+1 stories, and go from a height of 35 feet to a height of 37 feet, and from an FAR of 0.7 to an FAR of between 1.0 by right and 1.2 by special permit. And then in the center business, which was like Garden Street, 2.5 stories, 35 feet, and a 1.0 FAR, was ultimately, I believe, changed to 2+1 stories, 37 feet. I don't know why there's a significance of the 2 additional feet, but nevertheless. And interestingly, an FAR from 1 to 2.0 by right and 3.0 by special permit. And then elsewhere in the center business district, in the area just south of Great Plain, to go to 3+1 stories, a height of 48 feet, and again an FAR of 2.0 to 3.0, either by right or by special permit. And then the lower Chestnut Street was 2.5 stories to 3+1 stories, from 35 feet to 48 feet, from 0.7 FAR to 1.5 by right and 2.0 from by special permit. And then the medical overlay remains at 4 stories, 55 feet of height, and a 1.0 FAR. Speaking of the hospital, forgive me, but my blood sugar level is low and I might have to eat a little sugar to balance my fun of diabetes. So those, I think, were the substantive changes. And there were some other particular elements for slope roof and so forth, but to what extent have we seen any redevelopment as a result of those zoning changes? I'm not sure that that we've seen. Bob, I think Petrini owns a building down, a medical building down Chestnut Street towards the junction. Do you remember roughly when that was built?
07.
07, so that was before the changes.
Right.
So
Adam, just a question. When were all these changes made?
I believe they were, I think it was 2010 or maybe early 2011. So it was at least a decade ago.
Thanks.
So one of the comments that we've heard before and that we've discussed as a broader committee is the challenge with this area of fractional ownership. It's a lot of small lots. So and yet we haven't achieved the full potential of the newer zoning changes. So is this something where it's just going to take time for the market to step in with its market forces, or are additional incentives needed to actually achieve these goals, or do we have the wrong goals for the area? Feel free to jump in. That's an open question.
So I just wanted to point out that what I did send out in an email also last week is that the goals for these two districts are outlined. The Needham Center Development Plan that I emailed out late last week on page 3, because I know the focus of our discussion last time this group got together was what are the goals for these districts? It's when Stu Agler joined us, and it was an important question. And so they are outlined in this study. I have since had follow-up conversations with the planning director, Lee Newman, just to confirm that no new goals have been outlined or adopted by the planning board. And I also made sure that no new goals were also adopted by the select board. So even though these date back to 2009, they are still very relevant to our work today.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
So
Adam, do you mind if I ask some stupid new guy questions?
please.
I have so many stupid new guy questions. You guys are going to be like, put him on mute.
We've all used them, Jeremy. We've all used them.
I'm gonna use my chips while I have them, right? So I think I heard your question of, can we as a town put things into motion that the market otherwise isn't doing on its own accord? That's really the issue? Is it seems like most of the property owners are not highly motivated to make a lot of change, whether that's either by sale or by redevelopment. And is there something we can do about that?
So that's one of the questions, and in more particular, we did actually discuss this before. And one of the points that some of our members have made is that it's very difficult. Most of these buildings, if not all, are fully tenanted up. And if they're not, the vacancies don't last that long.
Yeah.
And so just to complete that thought, it's a heavy burden on a property owner to displace an existing tenant and to wait for all of the leases to come to an end and not renew and take the risk and certainly the lack of income, because once the tenants are out and you don't renew any leases, you've got a vacant building, you go through a permitting process, then a construction process, and that can be another 2 years or 2.5 years before you have any new income coming in.
So just a crazy thought process, because when I read that one of the key concerns was either having to disrupt a tenant or the loss of tenant income. Has there been any exploration of the town basically putting up flex space? And by way of example, imagine that you had a pretty large but somewhat Spartan facility, and you could move tenants into there for 6 months to 12 months with reasonable setup costs, and then the tenant could move in there while the building was being demolished or whatever was happening to a building. And I don't know if that's reasonable or feasible or anything, but you could imagine that the owner might kick in the dollars willing to do that because they're going to get the value of the leasehold and they're going to get the value of the redevelopment increase, and at the same time not disrupt the tenant. But I don't know if that's a crazy idea or not a crazy idea.
I'm going to throw the answer to Mike Wilcox and to Bob Henschel because their businesses, own a sizable amount of real estate in town, and they can best answer that. So, Mike or Bob?
Thanks, Adam. It sounds like it could be somewhat complicated. I mean, our tenants in retail in Wellesley and Concord, I think, are pretty well vested in their locations for them to relocate, assuming that there's a funding source from the town to create that sort of flex, may create some hardship or concern about loss of business and how the parking relates to the new location versus the existing location. So, I mean, it sounds like it solves the issue. I just don't know in implementation whether there's a few hurdles that would need to be, worked out. And if one decided not to, or others did, the owner may be in the same position of not having that sort of flexibility to do the renovation that we're talking about.
Bob, do you have anything to?
Yeah,
add?
I would support that. For retail, this location is very specific and the space is highly specialized. It would be difficult to make generic retail space that would be somewhat fungible. And in general too, tenants don't like to move. Tenants typically don't move unless they have to. It's usually because they're either growing or shrinking, but to make a lateral temporary move is highly disruptive. So even for an office tenant, I think it'd be a tough thing to convince them to do.
So from what it sounds like we're hearing in the private sector, Jeremy, it's a challenge for an existing tenant, and it's certainly a challenge for a landlord to create space that's going to be able to continue to support business, for instance, for the retail sector and also perhaps for the office sector, and to move tenants in and around several times. So that's multiple moves. From the public sector, and that's also assuming that there's actually vacancies in any of the private enterprise owned buildings. From the public sector, it's an interesting question. For instance, one building that has been used and will continue to be used as swing space for the town is Hillside, the former Hillside School. But I think to what Bob and Mike were saying, if there were businesses that, let's say, just to play this out, that were located on Chestnut Street, that suddenly then moved to Hillside, first of all, Hillside may not be zoned for commercial activity, that particular school or where it's located. And second of all, even if it were, then all of those businesses would have to relocate for some period of time to that building. And then we're going to push a ton of traffic, specifically to West Street and along those other neighborhoods onto Central and Highland Avenue, which can pose other problems. But the biggest problem is that the public sector doesn't have the space in order to make that possible for the next several years. Because as I understand it, I think there are some plans underway to enable Hillside to continue to be used as flex space for other capital projects happening throughout the town. Like for instance, at Emery Grover, the school administrative staff may move from Emery Grover to Hillside, and that would happen for the next several years. But after that, who knows? Typically, the town has a need for all of its space and likely will not have the space available long enough in the right zoning districts to be able to accommodate that kind of a request. But it's certainly an understandable question.
So there were two things that kind of inspired the thought. One was, I know, and this is obviously office to office, so it wasn't the challenge of dealing with restaurants or other kinds of specialized use, but my office in the Seaport, when we were demoing, we actually took an extra floor in the building and we moved one floor up at a time, demo the floor, move the floor back down. And, it was a lot of logistical challenge, but it was the way to get it done without having to actually move permanently in order to accomplish the goal. The second was, I don't know how many of you are familiar in the seaport with the great moving of the Our Lady of Voyage or whatever it was church. Does that sound familiar to any of you? This is when they redeveloped Seaport Square. Basically, the developer and the town reached out to the archdiocese, and they basically built them that brand new church right next to Fort Point. And the deal was, you know, we need this land for good purposes. You still need a church. We'll basically build you a new church in exchange for the move. And that one change is what basically allowed the entirety of the development in that area. I mean, it's a huge amount of value was unlocked just because of the random kind of situated nature of that parcel. And so, you know, an example might be, you know, I look at the VFW building in the lot that's sitting there that often sits empty most days, right? It's a big parcel of land. It's a one-story building. It's not very well utilized. You can imagine the town saying, you know, we'll build you a brand new facility somewhere else in exchange for unlocking that access. And I don't know if those kinds of things have been explored, so I don't want to presume that they haven't. But it was just a thought that if we wait for market forces to go, and these are all individually owned lots, my guess is we may be having the same conversation 10 years from now.
Matt, you've presided over the CEA before. Has that kind of a concept been battered about?
I think it's a great idea. I have not heard it battered about though, but I do think it's a good idea for us to explore, Jeremy. These new ideas that you have, whether it's swing space or this, you know, are very, very helpful. I think we should explore it.
Typically,
Jeremy, along those lines, when I was reading the analysis that was put together, yeah, I think with the town, this notion of paying into a parking fund and the town eventually one day maybe building a parking structure to accommodate the demand. I think the sequencing of that is a little backwards. I think the town needs, if the town really wants to affect change here, I think the parking needs to come first. You know, I think to ask a developer to build a building knowingly with limited parking and hope that the building is going to be viable and work, that, you know, someday the parking will come, tomorrow may never come. So I think, you know, and I like your idea that the town should be more proactive in these things. And I think that's maybe a little bit more of a straightforward, achievable way to do that.
I think that it's interesting that, you know, would the town actually itself buy private property to enable, you know, swing space for the commercial activity for a period of time until there's enough of a redevelopment where it's no longer necessary, then perhaps dispose of the building if it doesn't use it for other purposes. I'm not sure that we would get support from town meeting, but it's an interesting concept. And like Matt said, it hasn't really been kicked around before. I will say that, you know, it's an interesting point that Bob's brought up as well about the need for, for additional parking in town. And I think, Amy, the town is going to conduct a parking study this year.
That's correct. There's funding in the warrant for this May's town meeting, assuming that it gets approved. The parking study would take place, I would say, early fall of this year. It's going to encompass not only Needham Center, but Needham Heights.
So I think what I'd like to do is I don't, you know, that'll probably come through the planning board. And because we report into the select board, but also I sit on the planning board, I think it would be useful for, you know, for the CEA to have some role in that parking study.
Just to clarify, I'm managing that parking study. So it's not coming through the planning board. It's been assigned to me.
Well, look at that. Thanks for the clarification.
That was
So Amy, I think that I definitely want to come back to Bob's point and flag that as part of the question that we look at in the study. One of the things that we also looked at when we were doing our walking tour is we saw there would be an opportunity in the lot kind of behind, where was that? Behind Cook and Needham Center Fine Wine, Citizens Bank,
James.
Baker's Best. Do you know that lot I'm talking
Yeah.
about?
The James, the parking lot with the James.
Exactly. And so, and potentially putting a second level on that, which would, if you had twice as much or almost, if you maybe 80% of parking that's currently available on the surface up on the second level, that would significantly increase, the parking. One point that did come up last night in the planning board meeting, I think at one of the hearings, was some people were, this is to Rick's point, some people were not aware of the actual parking signs in town. And so although we accomplished a goal of having the town actually be able to install those signs, I think what we've all acknowledged, and it was reaffirmed last night, is that the directional parking signs themselves are probably too small. And there may not be enough of them to direct, traffic to those parking spots. So Amy, another point that we should, add to the parking study is whether we have enough parking directional signs and if they're big enough.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Adam, and maybe it goes back to Jeremy's question before as well, just a couple of thoughts. So what the town has done in the past with some new tenants is it's kind of required parking for its employees in other places. Now that doesn't free up a ton of spots, but I think when Masala Art came in, I think one of the requirements was to park perhaps down by the Heights, and then they shuttled them over. And you see that with a couple of different retail things. So if we're hearing that parking is a big issue, if that is the case, then there are other ways, obviously, to potentially do it. And even like you said, Adam, there'll be people with a second level, there's characteristic issues that come up, right? Does it change the fabric? Does it, the restaurant's now outdoor dining in there, right? In that parking lot. So, we've even talked in the old days, wouldn't it be kind of cool if Needham had almost like a trolley, like a little street trolley that on wheels, not new tracks, but that kind of just brought people back and forth. So just throwing it out there as other ideas, just relative to if we think there is an issue with respect to parking causing any of these concerns.
That sounds like a good idea. Amy, can you add that? We're chatting about parking.
Yes.
That I think what you're saying, Matt, is the potential to create additional parking assets elsewhere for employees and for town employees, and then to be able to free up those spots in the prime areas to support retail, and then to have a shuttle service somehow to link everyone. That would run on some basis.
That's right. And or even if it's not for employees, I mean, imagine a day where Needham had, you've got the business center, you've got people that go to the Heights. So forget about even employees, but just residents that decide, let's take the old days, I think it was maybe Condon or somebody during the days, they would have the trolley going up and down the street. I call it a trolley, whatever you call it. It's like in San Francisco.
Matt, do you mean those ones where the people are pedaling and drinking at the same time?
Those would be good too. That would work too, Rich.
That'll be like a mobile brew pub.
There you go.
They have those.
Kill two birds with one stone right there.
We can get the James. We can get the James to sponsor that. Easy.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to point out one of the exercise that this committee was going through is to take a look at the current regulations to see if there is anything that is serving to be an obstacle or impediment to development. So one of the things that we talked about at our last meeting is the parking requirements. Why do we have certain parking requirements for restaurants or other types of businesses if they are just going to get a waiver from the planning board? Do we need to re-examine that? So if the automatic knee-jerk reaction is to seek a waiver, then perhaps we shouldn't be requiring it in the first place. But in order to better understand that, we need the results from the parking study data to analyze. So until we go through this comprehensive analysis of not only our inventory, but what the parking management plan is, and then how to best address it from there, I think a lot of these conversations about parking are going to just continue to go in circles because we just don't have the data to base any recommendations on. And incidentally, I had a recent conversation, this will be my last 1 minute on parking, recent conversation with the parking clerk at Town Hall. And what I came to discover is that on Saturdays, so the permit parking spots that not only Town Hall staff use, but employees and owners of businesses in Needham Center, those parking permits are only Monday through Friday. So on Saturday, you can't use your parking permit to park in a permitted spot. And all of the parking in the rest of Needham Center on street is only 2 hours, and in the lots is only 2 hours. So basically, we are leaving employees and business owners to scramble to find spots because they will get ticketed if they park in a public lot for more than 2 hours. So not only are we, penalizing the owners and the staff, but what about somebody who wants to come to Needham Center and go out to lunch and shop or get a service done? We're not providing any incentives for these folks to come and park and walk around and visit a variety of businesses. So that is definitely an urgent need, and I'm anxious to get that parking study done, but it looks like it's probably going to happen in early fall. So I'll keep you posted on any developments in that area.
Amy, to that point, on the corner of Great Plain Avenue, you have, in the center of town, you have Sweet Basil, Little Spoon, and Latina. Little Spoon was the most recent restaurant. What was required of those three for parking?
I can't.
Or were they all wavered?
I can't speak specifically to those. I don't know the answer to that, but I can find out.
So last night, actually, Latina applied for a special permit for outdoor dining in an alleyway, and parking was a question. And those restaurants do, as have been happening with a number of businesses throughout the town, there's actually been a substantial number of parking waivers. So
that's the point. That's the point.
Which is,
as Amy said, why do they have a parking requirement if all they do is come in and get waivers anyway?
To reduce the parking demand. I mean, to reduce the parking capacity.
Right, but if there's I think what the point that Amy was making, if there's a parking requirement, but they come in and they get a waiver anyway, what's the point of having a parking requirement? Is that right, Amy?
That's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah.
So I think
I agree with that.
I think the biggest question what's happening as a result is, and this was true before the pandemic, is the forgive me, but it's something like it's either a national or international traffic engineer. It's the Institute of Traffic Engineers. It's a national body. They put together a guide on the required parking based on uses for different kind of districts, and that's the basis of the parking requirements in our zoning bylaws, which sets out, for instance, you need, let's say, 100 parking spaces. And yet, if businesses are seeking a waiver to go from 100 down to 70 or 100 down to 90, then what it's telling us is that the demand for parking is less than the supply of parking, which is a paradox for for our conversation on parking, because we're saying we don't have enough spaces, and yet a number of businesses are asking for a reduction in the parking requirement, saying that they have sufficient parking as is. So
I think that's the reason why they do that, is because they can't meet the parking requirements. You say, okay, I have enough parking. Just give me the permits. Just give me the permits. I can run my business. But I can't physically meet what the parking requirement requires.
I think that's right. I think that has been the case in some areas, and in other areas that I've been seeing, we've been waiving parking requirements, in part because the demand for parking is not there. That space is better utilized for other purposes. So it's both forces, and yet the study, I think, will also bear that out and provide more information for all of us to think through. Is that right, Amy?
Sounds pretty
That's the
accurate.
plan.
Yeah. So you can spend hours talking about parking, and I've probably spent countless hours in my previous position and in this position talking about parking. And I think until we have the data to get too deep into it in these conversations probably isn't a good use of our time. But I did want to circle back to some of the observations that the committee made during the walking tours. And one of the things was building height. And I did follow up on a point that was discussed at our last meeting because the overlay district that encompasses Chapel Street, that is overlay district, I think that one's B, but I'll double check. But my point being is that we are limited with height. And the reason being, and I went back and I did some research on this, is that back in 2009, when they did the downtown study, and then again, subsequently, it was used to provide the basis for the overlay districts, is that no building within eyeshot or is in a very close proximity of town hall, no building height could be higher than the cornice on town hall. So from what I understand, there was widespread support for adopting that back in 2009, 2010. Whether that still exists today is hard to say. Perhaps you all would know better than I would because I haven't been around long enough to know that. But I think it's going to be interesting because this is going to come up in conversations as the planning department and the planning board starts to tackle the MBTA density with regard to housing, the adoption of the density and how that's going to impact Needham Center. So I think they're going to come up in conversations again. But I mean, if we can perhaps focus on very kind of specific things in the short term that we might be able to identify that we think might be an obstacle for redevelopment. So, limiting the building height, do the numbers work for a developer if they want to come in and we're talking about taking these single story commercial buildings and, wouldn't it be great if they had, 2, 3, and maybe even 4 stories on them to, build density, to have residents to not only live in Needham Center, to support the businesses, to create more foot traffic, that sort of thing. So are there specific things that we can sort of focus on in the next, 18 minutes that we have here before we promised everybody that we'd do a hard stop at 9:30 and then in future meetings, but very specific things that we can focus on as far as making recommendations for either the planning board to take a look at. Certainly we've got to go through the right process of approaching the select board with any recommendations we may have, which would then get referred over to the planning board. But just sort of wanted to circle back because I think we could get caught up in parking very easily and spend, a lot of our time talking about that. But until we have the data, I think a lot of our conversations might not be very productive in that way.
Amy, if I can comment on this, I think the idea that no building within eyesight of town hall can be higher than the cornice, it's a nice, quaint idea. I think. I mean, this isn't Washington D.C., but the quaint idea is standing in the way of progress that I think overall can benefit the town. I mean, one way to solve the problem is to raise the height of the cornice.
I was going to say, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, add a tower on top of the cornice, and now you can raise the height of the buildings within eyesight.
That's funny.
Do we know what the cornice height is and what it sort of correlates to in terms of stories?
I can find out the exact height, but I think it was done with the idea of sort of respecting the historic integrity of town hall and the cornice and not wanting a building within close proximity to overshadow that significance.
We did though, we remember we saw some photos from the History Center that showed there was significant height. I think these were 3-story buildings back in the day when 3 stories, I think, was probably taller than today. They were large, I think, if not mixed use manufacturing buildings and other commercial buildings. Do we know what offhand, Amy, what the that height proximity is for that cornice restriction? Is it just on Chapel, Highland, and Great Plain?
I believe so.
Within 50 feet of Town Hall?
Let me confirm that, but those 3 streets that abut Town Common and Town Hall, to my understanding, it is those particular streets that have the limitation.
This is a very, very, very important question to answer. Being able to build 2 stories versus 4 stories, there are so many common fixed costs between the two. The economics for a 4-story would work a lot better than the economics for a 2-story because of those common fixed costs. You have a certain size foundation you have to pour, a stronger foundation probably for a 4-story building, but still a lot of the fixed costs that you would incur for a 2-story building would not change for a 4-story building. So the economics will work for a 4-story building. And that's the only way you're going to get anything done, is if the economics work. There's no one's going to fall on the sword for the sake of the town to build something if they go bankrupt doing it.
Of course. Yeah, another way to look at it is, a way to balance both. So let's say, and Amy will provide us with more information for our next meeting. And yet, if we're in a scenario where let's say it's a 50-foot setback of Town Hall. So within 50 feet of Town Hall, you have a 2-story building height. But beyond that, you then have a 3rd story or a 4th story. So you can imagine, a building going like this. So you're able to respect to some, preserve the character of the town center, in particular Town Hall on the one hand. And then as you get a little farther back in the lot, like what we did with Muzzy, you increase the height. So still on the same lot. So it's something that we'll have to look at when Amy is able to get us some more information. The other thought that I have is, Amy, you and I put together these spreadsheets for the dimensional regulations. And I just want to confirm that they relate to the goals that were set out in that study from years ago. It does look like those were implemented. So where do we go? Where do we go from here? It sounds like there are some other areas that may not necessarily relate specifically to dimensional regulations. Although Amy and I will look into the restrictions around Town Hall. Mac, do you recall any offhand prior discussions about the heights around Town Hall specifically?
Yeah. I mean, it's the same conversation as we're talking about here. It's a historical thing, and I haven't heard anybody say that it's caused issues necessarily, but I think Amy put it well before, like parking will always come up, traffic will always come up. And, if it's the height issue, that will come up. And we've kind of just said, we just have to kind of move past it, is what at least historically we said.
Adam, I want to share, can everybody see the map I just brought up on my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So can you see my cursor moving around?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. So this area right here that is sort of a checkerboard, that is Needham Center Overlay District A. So that encompasses, so this is Town Hall right here, the red star. So this is Overlay District A. So if you can see, Overlay District A goes down Great Plain Avenue to one side of Town Hall and down Great Plain Avenue to the other side of Town Hall. It is opposite on Great Plain Ave and down Chestnut Street. So this whole area. So it's interesting that this Overlay District A, which has a more height. So you were allowed to do up to, I believe 3 stories. Let me just look at, yeah, it's 3 stories, 37 feet, or 3 + 1 stories for a total of 48 feet in this Overlay District A. Overlay District B is just this area with the diagonal lines. And the height restriction for Overlay District B is 27 feet. So what's interesting is that, you know, again, I'm being told that within, you know, proximity to Town Hall, no buildings can be higher than the cornice. However, the overlay districts, again, in Overlay District A, it really is within close proximity of Town Hall. So why was it allowed here, but not in Overlay District B? I just want to point that out.
maybe
Because
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's a great question that we should look into. I wonder if the
It seems like it
topography-
was something that sounded good in theory, but in practice, it makes no sense.
But it's also, I mean, the other point is, if we look where, Amy, if you could bring your cursor to Town Hall,
yeah,
and then just a little bit south across the street of Great Plain. So what we're saying is this area here does have a higher height than what's currently available. I mean,
correct.
that the
Currently
zone
allowed.
allows for a higher height than what's currently built. And if you move over to the right on Dedham Street, on Dedham Ave, that's where that build that I think it's 50. I can't remember that's the right address.
Yes,
Where-
50 Dedham Avenue.
Where they do have that higher height. They do have mixed use, which was part of the goals of the plan. But that's the only area that has that's been able to achieve the goals of that zoning district, which was passed many years ago. I think what we're saying here is there is a distinction of at least another story and between 48 and 27, almost 20 feet of height, just kind of where Baker's where the bagel shop is, right?
Mhm.
And where Cook is and so on. So we'll have to talk to Lee and try and understand, because you can see that line of demarcation, and maybe it's time for overlay B to just be one overlay and join A. But it's worth noting that even with the change to overlay A, that we haven't achieved the heights and it hasn't spurred enough development. And I think part of that is, for instance, like, where would Harvey's go? Harvey's is right on the corner. Where would Harvey's go for the period of time, and all of the tenants that are in that building go for that period of time? It's difficult and can kill business.
It's not only that, Adam. One of the problems is how in that block between Highland Ave and Pickering, on either side of Great Plain Avenue, how many different owners do you have? And trying to get everybody to agree so that you can have an economic sized development there. That's one of the problems that you mentioned it early on when you were speaking about the what did you call it? The
Fractional ownership.
Yes, the fractional ownership. That's one of the issues. Too many people have to agree to allow a project of the kind of size and scope we're talking about.
They all have to sell if there are 12 owners in that small area.
Right.
Each of them has to
Good
sell.
luck. Good
Yeah,
luck
I
with
mean,
that.
I mean, Walt Disney was able to build his enterprise in Florida by secretly buying up land parcel by parcel by parcel. And then over time, the last piece that he bought was far more expensive than the first few pieces that he bought because, no one knew what was happening and why. And then by the end, obviously they did. And, it's certainly, I think that's true. It's a challenge. But the point that I guess we're making here is that here we have a scenario where the zoning was intended to provide an incentive, and yet these owners, in spite of a higher height, are choosing not to sell.
Yeah.
Generational ownership, they probably have no debt on the buildings, and they're leasing to tenants who will pay the price, which is one of the reasons why we see so many banks in town.
Right.
They're willing to pay the price. Whoever owns the building has the incentive to get as much money as they can. They don't really care if you're a bagel shop or a restaurant or a clothing store. But if the clothing store can't pay me whatever, 30, 40 bucks a foot, but the bank can, I'm going with the bank. And you can't regulate that.
And how many of your, Mike and Bob and and Rick, how many of your tenants, how many landlords would forego? It's one thing, to have a vacant space for 2 or 3 months and forgo those 2 or 3 months of rent, which is kind of the cost of doing business if there is a vacancy, as opposed to demolish, calling everyone's leases to an end, vacating the building intentionally, going through the permitting and the building process, and being 2 or 3 years before you're collecting any additional rent. So those multiple generations don't seem, to want to go that period of time with no income. They want the income today, even if it means they've got a vacancy for a short period of time. Bob, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was basically just going to make that exact point. It's an awful lot of effort and risk to go through to add an extra story onto a building. I mean, these buildings here are Harvey's building is 3 stories, right? So to add an extra story and take on all that risk and financial hardship in order to do it, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I think you see wholesale redevelopment. Not only is it situations where you can increase the density significantly, but also where you can increase the rent significantly. And I'm not so sure that exists in Needham Center right now. I think we saw it in Needham Crossing where you're converting warehouses into office buildings. I think the spread is great enough there that it starts to make sense, but you're going to replace retail tenants with retail tenants. There's no spread there. But speaking of Harvey's, I think oftentimes what happens, what spurs on development are these once in a lifetime changes, which they're going through right now. Who knows what their thought process is right now? You have a building, an older building that's obviously damaged to some level. Maybe now's the time where you make that decision to redevelop it. I don't know the particulars of what they're going through, but it's a
valid point.
Now might be the time.
Yeah.
Jeremy.
Oops, sorry, go ahead.
No, I have an unrelated point, so if you want to follow on, please.
Yeah, I mean, just from my, in my experience, it's hard, retail is retail there. And I think there's always going to be someone that wants to, be in those, locations on the ground floor there. But from an office perspective or, from a medical perspective, even maybe not as much as office, it's hard to get these tenants that will pay, market or even more market, higher than market because of an expanded building to come all the way into Needham Center. It's simply too far off of the highway. I mean, in 20 years, I don't know. I mean, there's not a lot of office space, in there. I mean, the closest thing that I've worked on and done, leases at, actually, we did a deal on Pickering a few years ago when Equity bought it, but mean, there wasn't a ton of activity to go into that building. I mean, we got lucky with the tenant that we put in there, but I mean, we represent Rosemary Street for Equity Industrial across from Sudbury Farms. And even there, I get, pushback or hesitation from tenants that want to go look, at that building because it's a little bit too far off of the highway from them. And then obviously, being in Needham Center, it's even further.
The only product type that I think works, and I'm going to beat this drum again, is residential. It solves a lot of problems in Needham.
You mean if we increase the density, that would increase the
go up.
demand for retail, and that might spur enough of a redevelopment of the commercial area?
We need more of that type of residential, and to have it in an area where the people who live there can walk out of their places and support the retail. It solves a problem. It would attract retail. It has a place for empty nesters to live. You have the access to the train within walking distance. That's the only product type that I could see going vertical. And hey, here's a popular idea that I'm sure would work. You always have eminent domain.
So, Bob, I just want to go back to what you were saying before to make sure I understand, because this is an important point that I don't think we've necessarily have battered about here yet. If, let's say, and I can't recall offhand, and forgive me for putting everyone here on the spot, but for particularly the brokers, is prime and the property owners, is prime retail price per square foot roughly, is it $35 or $50 per square foot in Needham Center for retail space? Do you guys know?
Closer to 30 than it is to 50.
So let's say it's $35 a square foot. So Bob, what you're saying is at $35 a square foot, if you added an additional story and a little bit more density, the economic risk of tearing down the building, forgoing those tenants, displacing the tenants, going through the construction period, rebuilding, unless you can really get $70 a square foot, just as an example, it's not worth it to redevelop it. Is that right?
Yeah.
If you got $40 a square foot, that $5 delta isn't enough to pay for the cost of the reconstruction, and the revaluation of the building thereafter. Is that right?
Yes.
And to Rick's point, the concept is if we increase the density enough, we'd help drive the demand from $35 a square foot to $40 or $45 a square foot, to attract a more diverse, interesting retail base, because there's more there's more foot traffic to support those businesses. Is that right?
Maybe. What I'm saying is that it'll certainly secure, it'll create more business for those retailers, and maybe that'll increase rent. But at the very least, it'll make those retailers that are there, their businesses a little bit more profitable, I would think, because there's more foot traffic, and that's what they need in downtown.
So I think what we're saying is we have the existing zoning in place, but there are market forces and conditions outside of the zoning that have been prohibiting the full realization of the goals for this village concept. Jeremy, go ahead.
So the other thing I wanted to ask, and maybe you all know, or maybe Amy, you could send it around, but I have no understanding of what the current incentives picture is between the town and developers. Are there existing tax incentives or workforce incentives? I don't know what exists today, so it's hard to know what we're doing or not doing. Is that something anybody has a list of?
So generally speaking, the type of incentive that a municipality has utilized to attract certain kinds of development may be what's called a TIF. And that, I think, was a program that TripAdvisor was able to utilize. And the real reason for utilizing the TIF is that it triggers other additional state funding. So it's important at a local level, but the bigger relief that it provides, I think, is that it unlocks additional state funding. The town is not really in a position to be able to defer much for property taxes or excise taxes. And there hasn't been a lot of support to date to provide more direct financial incentives, if that's what you're talking about.
I'm just asking a question of what is the list of things that are already approved?
Yes.
Whether that's TIFs or property tax exemption generally, or workforce development support. Like, I just don't know what is, in order for us to think about what we could be doing. And regardless of whether we ought to be doing it, I just don't know. I don't know the facts on the ground.
So it's a good question. I think, Amy, what we can do is speak to Dave Davison's office, who's the director of finance, and get a greater understanding of what those incentives are, kind of have like a catalog so we understand what they are. It would include things like, and they exist in different areas. So for instance, there's an affordable housing trust fund that, that businesses can pay into, which helps subsidize affordable housing in town. But we'll look into those other programs so we have an idea. That is helpful, and it's a good question, Jeremy. Amy, do you know offhand what other incentives the town has?
I don't, because quite honestly, they've been very specific to a project. So as you just mentioned, the TripAdvisor TIF is the most recent one that comes to mind. So there's no sort of blanket incentives that would provide motivation for anybody to develop sort of, it's not sort of, a blanket for Needham Center or for the New England Business District. It's been specific for projects or developments.
Matt, can you've had some experience with this, I think, through, your client work and also through the CEA and, town meeting. Can I put you on the spot here? Do you have anything to add to what's been said?
I don't. I mean, I know of the TIF, obviously, for TripAdvisor. That's the only one I know, and that's the big one. I don't know that we'd have a lot of other stuff. I mean, some folks may have applied for certain like training grants and stuff potentially. But other than that, I don't think it would be town specific. It would be more like a business that may have benefited from certain federal or state credits, from a tax perspective, or something that they would have applied for on their own, employee retention and so forth. But that would have been the business themselves, not necessarily the town.
Okay.
I mean, just by way of example, right? I don't know that whether Needham is, part of the opportunity zone program, if there's any places there. I don't know if we've got impact fees or, things like value capture programs or anything else that people have done to do redevelopment. And I don't want to retread old ground, but similarly, and just to something you said, and not to be the fly in the ointment as the new guy, but I guess I don't want to go into our recommendation process with a thought of what the town can afford, in the sense of, it may be the right answer that the town needs to tighten its belt at the present in order to get something it wants later on, right? The kind of the definition of investment. So I don't want to cut off any avenues that we say because we look at the budget and say there's no room for anything. I think if we present something and then people, the select board can make an assessment about whether or not they want this thing or that thing. But what I'm hearing is that if things continue as is, there is not likely to be strong change absent these, one-off kind of life change events like the fire or other things. That it's really hard given the fractionalization problem. And I think, Michael, you mentioned that if there's not more density brought to the program to support more retail, it's hard to get people to invest into more retail. So anyway, my 2 cents.
I like the out of box thinking. And I think you're asking good questions, new guy or not. And we'll look into what those incentives are. And I like the idea. I mean, so people are aware, this type of an exercise is, would include gaining the support from the select board, finance committee, and then town meeting to support it. So there are multiple, and it's just important to be aware of what that process is in order to gain the broad support necessary to make a change that could unlock some, that would unlock redevelopment, basically, so we can achieve the potential. So unless anyone has anything else to add to this discussion, I think we have a number of good points here to explore. But it doesn't sound like there's necessarily anything specifically in the zoning that we're looking to change immediately. We do have some questions about parking. We do have some questions that Amy and I will look into about the town hall specifically. And we'll get some answers and come back. And then at that point, if we've determined that there's nothing really further in terms of the zoning, if there are other recommendations, other regulations that may be specific to the area that you think would be helpful if changed, we can look at those. And
Adam, if I could interrupt for a second, one of the things we did discuss about the zoning things, we talked about height, but we should probably also take a look at setbacks as well.
So Amy, I'm going to ask you to resend to everyone here the dimensional spreadsheet that we put together. Do we also have one? I think we also had one for the use table as well, right?
We did.
So
Yep.
can you send both to everybody? And then at our next meeting, Rick, I appreciate you bringing up setbacks. We did on our walking tour talk about, and I think it's in the minutes, some areas have like a 0 setback and others are a little different. And does that have an impact for achieving the goals? I think that's helpful. Amy, what I'd like you to do is probably to add, if you haven't, into the packet, the Lower Chestnut Street development program that you emailed to all of us, and then also the use table and the dimensional regulations for these areas. I think that's helpful to have. And we ultimately would like to come to a point fairly soon. If there are other dimensional issues, like Rick just brought up, other use issues, or yet a third category, kind of like what Jeremy is talking about, out of the box thinking, specifically to these 2 zones that we might explore if there's an opportunity to create the change to achieve the goals that were set out for the area, this village concept of more mixed use. And then I'd like us to turn our heads to a different area, which will determine together what area we want to look at next and go through a similar exercise. Does anyone else have any questions about?
I was just gonna, my only comment is when Jeremy was speaking, it just reminded me, and maybe it's a to-do for later, obviously, just if mass transit, there's always discussion around like commuter rail areas with incentives that the transit authority, whatever they call now, sometimes we'll do with the town. That's happened before. Yeah, and then I was gonna ask basically where I think you're going, Adam, is obviously we're focused on this one area. There may be lots of other more ripe areas for us to also, and we may already be doing that as a full CEA, to look at whether it's, even the Highland, in what Amy sent out, it included like the Highland corridor, down by the strip area with the ice cream place, the Cookie Monster and the Bertucci's and stuff. There are other areas in town, obviously that I'm sure people are pretty interested in seeing if we can do redevelopment as well.
That's right. Thank you for bringing that up. I will just specifically because it's so timely. The state has passed or is passing a law to promote greater housing in MBTA communities. It's designed to be create sweeping change and substantially contribute towards the housing stock in commuter towns. So our town, Needham, is going through a process, having reviewed the requirements, and is presently submitting a response back to the state, with some specific recommendations that could affect Needham, so we can be, so we're best positioned to take advantage of those requirements. That would include ultimately changing our residential district zoning probably in a year from now, something like that. So Matt, to your point, there is some sweeping change on the way. And Rick, that would go towards increasing our density, which would hopefully have an impact on, the diverse mix of commercial activity in town as well. So I can provide an update on another matter that we had spoken about. Amy had been working hard on coming up with brewery zoning to allow breweries in town.
Yep.
And ultimately, and last night at the planning board, we held a hearing to discuss the zoning. And to quickly summarize, the program is to change our zoning bylaws to allow breweries, and in particular a brew pub, which effectively is a restaurant that brews beer. So the primary business of the brew pub is the restaurant, and the accessory business or secondary business is the brewery. And then the second type of brewery business is a microbrewery, which its primary business is brewing beer, and the secondary or accessory business would be some kind of a food service. And that was brought up at a hearing last night. There were a number of people that have made some interesting, that provided some interesting comment. One in particular, as an example, was to create a restriction within a certain radius of residential areas to protect the residential areas. Some people have mentioned 150 feet. Some people mentioned 500 feet. So there may be an opportunity. I'm hoping that we can still move this forward to town meeting. There were some comments, additional comments, that made it seem as if it needed more work and more time, but I'm hopeful that we can try and get some of these questions resolved. Other people, part of the zoning also includes a tap room, or rather a tasting room, not a tap room. And that the concept was that it would be 25% of the total gross area of the microbrewery. And some people wanted to, or proposed increasing that or making some changes or creating some definitions. So hopefully we'll be able to get that through. Timing is tight because in order for this to go through town meeting in May, the planning board has 1 week to make any additional changes. Amy, do you want to circulate? Can you circulate the proposed zoning as currently is written to everyone here? And then, guys, I apologize. We've got a week to make the change, so we would need comments in the next few days. So basically, the zoning change, it's short. It defines what we're talking about, the brew pub. It defines a microbrewery, and then it also lays out very simply where those uses are allowed. All of the uses are by special permit. There is no brewery business that's available by right. If you guys could take a look at it and send back to Amy, and either Amy or Amy and I, any comments or questions that you have, that will be helpful, but we would need that feedback in short order, unfortunately. Does anybody else have anything else they want to?
Yeah, Adam, just one point, you mentioned that we probably wouldn't be exploring zoning changes downtown. I just wanted to reiterate, I think Amy's suggestion is really strong about combining the overlay districts. For no other reason, I think it could potentially lead to development, but I think it's also just good practice to make the bylaw simpler and easier to follow. Because right now it's pretty convoluted.
I'm sorry, I did not mean to out of hand reject the concept of a zoning suggestion for a zoning change. I'm certainly open to it, and that's one that we'll look at, and we'll discuss that again at our next meeting. So thanks for clarifying that, Bob.
And and another thing is, and maybe a way to affect change in terms of rents is to take a look at the use table. Although I can't really think of anything right now that would want to be in downtown Needham that the bylaw doesn't already allow one way or the other, but it just may be worth exploring.
And there may be certain uses that have different characteristics of their dimensional requirements because the nature of the use may have changed in the last 20 years. So
that's a good point.
Please do take a look, as Bob said, at the use table and the dimensional tables one more time, and we'll chat through this. And I think there does sound like an opportunity, to merge the overlay A and overlay B. And if there's any other changes, I just want to make sure that if we are submitting any, if we are recommending to the select board any changes in the zoning, that we've looked at all parts of it. So we have, the uses and the dimensionals and any other elements or regulations.
And that's right.
Does anyone else have anything else they'd like to add or mention or report on or question? Would someone like to? Oh,
I was gonna say we're at 9:51 and we did promise an hour and we're a little over. So I think that unless anybody has anything to add, we should try to meet as a subcommittee again, perhaps within the next month, just sort of keep the momentum going.
So Amy,
I'll
can you send out a doodle poll, please?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep.
Amy is basically pushing me off stage. So can I have a motion to adjourn?
So motioned.
So we have, I think, I'm going to go with a motion to adjourn by Rick, second by Bob Henschel. Dylan and Jeremy, thank you both for being here today. We're excited to have you guys on board. With that, is there any further discussion about the motion to adjourn? Seeing none, I'll call the roll. As I see it on Zoom, Adam Meisner. You might be muted.
Yes.
All right. Rick?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Jeremy?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Dylan?
Yes.
Mike Wilcox?
Yes.
And the chair is I. We have so adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great week, everybody.
Bye-bye.